In this video, we want to take a look at configuring a port forwarding rule for pfSense that would use an alternate port for Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. RDP uses by default port 3389, but if we look at our topology diagram, we just have a single IP address out here on our firewall. And so if we use the standard port of 3389, that port could only be used once, and we could direct to any one of our internal Windows hosts that are running RDP. But what we want to do is we want to use that single IP address and use alternate ports so that we can, by defining a port, we can get to any one of our Windows hosts using RDP. So let's kind of review some ground rules here. I'm going to be demonstrating this on ESXi host 35, which is for the ok.bobstaco.com domain. Now the IP address that's assigned to my pfSense firewall is this one here. Now this is different than the IP address that I used from the ESXi client to get to my ESXi server. And I initially got confused with that, but I got it straight now. So one IP address, like in my case ESXi35.bobstaco.com, will be used for my VM client, and then this address, though, is actually the address that's assigned to my pfSense firewall, which will be used for all of my port forwarding rules, and it's the internet IP on pfSense. Okay, so I made a note here that there's a couple of preconditions that you need to set up here. First of all, you need to create a record on your forward-facing split brain DNS, and for us that's on our Linux server. Now if you haven't done that yet, you can still create the rule, no problem. But when you go to do it, you won't use the name. This name is contingent upon that you have DNS configured for that name on your DNS server for your state domain. If you don't have the name configured, no problem. You can still test the port forwarding rule using the IP address on your external or WAN interface of pfSense and using the alternate port. All right, having kind of laid down some groundwork, let's go ahead and take a look at how this is done. And I've got an example here of what I'll do from off campus to test this once I'm done. Okay, let's move that out of the way. So we go into our firewall drop down and we go to NAT. This is very much like the DNS rule, port forwarding rule we created earlier, except we don't have any predefined definitions to use. We're not going to use the predefined remote desktop definition because it's locked into port 3389. So as before, we're going to listen on the WAN interface. RDP does use TCP/IP only. And then down here, this is where we will specify, if we specified RDP, which is in the list, MSRDP, there it is, we'd be locked into port 3389, but that's not what we want to use. We want to use, for DC1, we want to use 5101, and it's a single port, not a range of ports, 5101. Now, for DC1 then, to redirect that internally, for me, that's 172.16.18.200. And internally, we can go ahead and use port 3389. We don't have to do any messing around with that or reconfiguring of that, which is kind of difficult to do on a Windows machine. So we're good to go. So let's just review. Oh, let's give it a description first here. So this is RDP 5101 to DC1. Okay, let's review here then. So we're talking about a port forwarding rule. If we go up here to the tab, port forwarding, and the rules enable listen on our WAN interface, TCP/IP only. Moving on down, port 5101, have that redirected internally to 172.16.18.200, which is DC1, and on that server use port 3389, so we don't have to reconfigure it. And we've given it a name, and then we click save and apply. And as I often do, I would reboot. But let me show you once again that in addition to the NAT rule that we created, pfSense responded by creating the appropriate firewall rule. I really like this about pfSense. It knows that it needs the firewall rule. It takes the information you gave it from the NAT rule and goes ahead and creates it. And so we can review that here as well. Listening on IPv4 from any source, anybody out there on the internet, coming into the port that we defined, 5101, and then being redirected to 3389. The wildcard here is a little bit interesting, but if we go double check that, oh, okay, for the firewall rule it's going to listen, but on the NAT rule it's going to be specific to port 5101. 5101. So we're good. So I hope you found this video helpful, and you would just repeat this process going back into your NAT rules. You'd repeat it for your RTR. You would use basically the same rule. In fact, you could copy this rule. You could hit copy on it and modify it, or you could just start over and it'd be 5102 and 5103 and so on as you created the individual rules that would listen on a specific port and then forward it for RDP. A little bit tricky, a little bit unusual, but you all are familiar with it from having done this into site. We use this setup quite a bit in the past. So I hope this video you found it helpful.